Hey, it's Marcella Friel here, food and forgiveness mentor who helps health conscious women like you love and forgive yourself, your food, and your figure. And I'm also the founder of the Women Food and Forgiveness Academy. And I'm so happy to be here today with Mary Sheila Gonnella, who is my co-teacher in the Academy. Mary Sheila is a board certified nutritionist, Ayurveda practitioner. She's a chef, she's a mom, she's a basket weaver. She is a full-on girl genius. And, and today we're going to talk about something really, really important for women like you who are looking for a path of sustainable weight loss. If you're really done with dieting and you're ready for a deeper solution to your weight and body love struggles, Mary Sheila and I are going to talk today about eating meals, planning meals, and what a meal is. This is really foundational, so listen up because we've got some good information for you. Hey, Mary Sheila.
Hey, Marcella, nice to be here with you.
Yeah, so tell us about the difference between snacking and eating a meal.
Yeah, I really think that for a long time, the story went, have frequent small snacks all day. And I'm here to say it a little bit differently. And the reason is what I'll share along the way as well. But, when we're constantly snacking, we're constantly a little bit hungry. And it's always kind of curious, like, what are we snacking with? And traditionally, we were not snacking all day long. We were having a meal that was prepared, and hopefully prepared with love and with attention to the details, sitting down and eating that meal to actually feel the body and feel a fullness. And that's really a great way to think about it, as far as, when we sit down and have a meal, we want to have the food groups that are going to sustain and nourish us in a way that we feel good, we feel complete at the end of the meal, and we don't have to think about and feel hungry until it's time to have the next meal. And from an Ayurvedic perspective, it is really good to allow each organ of digestion to have rest in between meals. And in between meals is also a great time for hydration and movement. And so it's not a grazing, some people feel like they're just grazers, and it really is beneficial to have a meal, be done, clean up, and move on and do other things in your life, and then have another meal when you're ready.
Okay, so we're talking about meal, meal versus like meal, or snacking, grazing. You know what, before we get into talking about meals, I want to ask your opinion about meal replacement bars and meal replacement programs, because so many of our women come out of that practice of like, well, hey, it's got all the nutrients that you get in a meal, but like, why not meal replacement bars? Like,
Yeah.
what's the deal?
Well, it's kind of funny, Marcella, because when we were at your retreat in Colorado this last February, I had an evening where I was going to tell some jokes, and one of my jokes was about bars. And when we were traveling to the retreat, we stopped at the store, and one of the women was like, "Which bar should I get?" And it kind of made me laugh, because just because I'm a nutritionist doesn't necessarily mean I'm an expert on all the different bars, because there are a lot of them out there. And I think what I always like to say is, I think a bar is fine as like an emergency food. When you're hungry, you can, keep it in your purse or in the drawer of your office, whatever, but they're not a meal, and they're not going to satisfy you in the same way as a meal. And really what they are sort of originally made for is for athletes on the trail, right? You're going on a 20-mile bike ride. You can't carry a whole meal with you, so you carry this condensed nutrition. And that's when so there are appropriate times for it. But if all of a sudden you get into a place where it's replacing your meals, then it's not an emergency food anymore.
Well, that's really fascinating. The whole idea that a meal replacement bar is good for an emergency because, women will come into the academy and they're living on meal replacement bars, shakes, powders, supplements. And that the idea of it being an emergency is interesting because that's that's what the metabolism is getting. So chances are if you're living on meal replacement phenomena, your nervous system is in sympathetic mode, it's in fight or flight, you're running around, you're grabbing and going, and your system is in an emergency. And you're eating this emergency food. So, and then of course the cortisol starts pumping, and then why is it so hard to lose weight? Well, your body's in a state of inflammation. So what I get, Mary Sheila, is that a meal is, I know we're going to talk about this in a second, there's the mechanics of how you put a meal together. And then there's the environment of the meal, how we eat the meal. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about all that. Like
Absolutely.
what is a meal? And why is it, if I can just say this, like, why is it that, let's say, beta carotene in a meal replacement bar isn't the same as a carrot on your meal plate?
Right. Like an isolated nutrient that we know is
Yeah.
good for you, as opposed to finding it with the synergy of everything else that's in that carrot that's going to help it to absorb and metabolize and
And nourish us. And, I want to say one more thing. I know we're going to talk about what's a meal, but, that piece about the difference between beta carotene and a carrot, the food industry, the processed food industry, the multi-billion-dollar processed food industry wants us to be confused about these things. The food industry wants us to be focusing on individual nutrients versus the whole food source, because a carrot isn't as profitable as an isolated beta carotene unit that you can put in a meal replacement bar.
yeah, you don't see fruits and vegetables really being marketed.
No, you don't see television commercials for kale and lentils.
No. And you probably never will.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
I mean, and so, and hopefully we'll get to that too, but yes, absolutely, like how we eat it, right, is just as important, because we could have a great diet and eat really healthy. And I actually discovered that, and I'll get into the meal, but I discovered that when I was in nutrition school, my daughter was little and she was going to preschool just like 2 mornings a week. So in those 2 mornings, I literally conquered the world. And right before I had to go pick her up, 10 minutes before I'd have to leave, I would go in the kitchen because I was hungry, and I'd whip together a lunch, and I'd jump in my car and I'd be driving and eating. And I know, and I was in nutrition school and I had to write down my diet for the week. And when I got to that day, I was like, oh my gosh, that is like really sad. Like that's how I eat my lunch, because I had to say, like, what do I eat, with whom, where, how long did it take? And it gave me pause. So I did make change then. I said, okay, Mary Sheila, at a half an hour before you have to go pick her up, spend 10 minutes making your food, sit down for, 20 minutes or whatever, eat your food, clean up your kitchen, and then go pick your daughter up. And it was an act of self-love. But it felt better, and I enjoyed my meal better. And so it gave me more pleasure. So on so many levels, it was this whole transformation. And, I know a lot of us are guilty of sometimes like eating in the car, or eating, with our electronic devices, AKA our phones or our computers or tablets right on the table. And that is so distracting. And it's not true to, wow, look how this food came to us, came to our plate, came to our life, all the hands that touched it, the farmer that planted the seed, right? I mean, it's really outstanding to know that we can honor that meal just as much as it's been honored to where it got to us.
Yeah, no kidding. I know. That's a profound revelation that you're describing there. It's really, really powerful. So Mary Sheila, what is a meal?
Yeah.
How how do we know we're eating a meal versus eating like a snack on a plate?
Absolutely. And so, I always love, this is kind of my signature way to talk about a meal is, and it from my Ayurvedic background, but our hands are actually very similar size to our stomach. So one hand is an anjali, and then we've got two hands, right? And if you took your two hands right now and you just put it over a plate, it's also about the same size. And when you're little, you have little hands, and as you get bigger, you have big hands. So our hands can be a really great representation of what does a meal look like. And so every time we have a meal, we want to have some protein, right? So protein is going to be about the size of one palm or the quarter of your plate, or a deck of cards or a cell phone, right? If we have all these other things we can reference it from. But basically that's whether it's an animal protein, or a dairy or eggs or a grain or a bean or a combination to make a complete protein, or nuts and seeds. There's lots of ways to make up protein, but we want to have protein with each meal. Protein is the grounding cord. Protein helps, rebuild our structure and feeds the
So
brain.
the word protein means primary substance.
There you go.
So like what are we? If we are what we eat, we are those amino acids that make up the protein.
Yeah.
We are. Yeah. So that's
Well,
our protein.
primary substance. I'm excited to learn that. So we have a protein with each meal, and then we've got our other palm, or the other quarter of our plate, and that is our starchy carbohydrate. That is the food group that's primarily seeds, actually, like grains, beans, nuts, well, nuts and seeds, but grains and beans, and then root vegetables, which are usually the seed of the next crop, and winter squash. That's where the plant stores energy. Energy is starch, turns into sugar for us when we digest it. So that's the food group that raises our blood sugar. That's the food group, if we eat too much of it, we're going to, rather than the cells using it for energy, we're going to send it to the liver, convert it to fat, and store it for later. So that is the food group. We have to be mindful of how much we're eating. So if you, again, think about a quarter of the plate, that's a great way to balance that out. And if you're a vegetarian, you might have, half of your plate being more grains and beans, just to make sure you're getting enough protein. And that's also a starch.
And the piece about complex carbohydrates is really important
Right.
versus refined carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So can you just say something about that very briefly? Yeah.
Yes. So again, what I said here for this is grains, beans, root vegetables, and winter squash. Those are the complex carbohydrates that are starchy. But what do we do with those? We mill them, turn them into flour. So we refine them. We make them less complex. We refine them. We separate the fiber from the sugar, so we don't have to do all that digestive teamwork. And that means they're very high glycemic. They turn to sugar instantly. So that's our pasta, our bread, our chips, our crackers, our cookies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it actually much more of a kind of a dangerous substance to the body. The more we refine foods, the harder it is on our metabolism to keep up with that big amount of sugar. And again, our cells only need so much energy at once. And that also depends on how active we are. So we're going to have more sugar being turned into fat and stored for later. And just to kind of come back to that original question, generally when we're generally snacking on carbs. Those are the foods that are marketed to us. Those are the foods that we often crave if we're not getting the adequate protein. So it becomes we end up eating too much of them. And that's part of, what's a struggle that a lot of us have with gaining weight and losing weight. It's too many carbs.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So here we are.
Yep. So coming back to the plate. So I say, okay, what's my protein? What's my starchy carb? And then I wiggle my fingers. That's half of my plate. And I say, what are my greens, my non-starchy carbohydrate, my rainbow of colorful vegetables that do not contain a lot of sugar. It's not where the plant stores sugar, but it is where the plant has lots of phytonutrients. That's what all those colors are there protecting the plant, and then they end up protecting us as well. And then that's also where the plant is doing a lot of photosynthesis. So there's a lot of chlorophyll and magnesium and a lot of minerals that the roots are pulling up through the ground from the soil, and really just make part of that canopy of green. So there's so much in there, and there's a ton of fiber. So that really, like, green foods, colorful vegetables are literally like our everyday superfoods. We do not have to find them from, the forest of the Amazon forest. We can get them in our farmers markets, produce aisle, garden. And that is, we want to have at least half of your plate. Sometimes you can even do 3/4 of your plate of the greens, whether it's, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels,
Yep.
onions, garlic, zucchini, peppers, it just goes on and on.
Yeah, okay. And then the last piece.
So wiggle your thumbs. That's
Yep.
your fats, right? So we want to have fats with each meal. And, the thing about fats is fat doesn't make us fat. And fats are really essential. Fats are the building blocks of our hormones. They insulate us. Every single cell is a cell membrane made of fats. So we don't want to fear fats, but we want to have good quality fats, because fats are bound by oxygen. They can oxidize. So we want to think about, I always say I'm not a raw foodist, but I try to eat my fats more on the raw side than cooked side. And of course I don't do that all the time, but that's a good way to think about it. So like nuts and seeds have good quality fats. Eating them more raw than roasted is better.
Yeah.
And eating nuts and seeds rather than having tons of nuts and seed oils is also better. Avocados, olive oil, coconut oil, butter, ghee, sesame oil. And then when we eat,
I'm a big fan of animal fats, saturated animal fats, like chicken schmaltz and beef tallow and lard, and those are, you're not going to eat those raw. But in terms of cooking fats, like, they have such a high heat point, they're so stable.
Yeah.
And they're so nourishing.
Yeah, so anytime you are eating any kind of animal protein or dairy or eggs, you're getting fat in there as well. So yeah, unless, sometimes we have sushi or whatever. But in general, the more saturated a fat is, the more so the more solid it is at room temperature, the more it actually can hold up to heat. When we cook with,
you don't want to be heating like your sunflower oils, or like those are, or the vegetable oils. Like, those are the things that we've been taught that are healthier to cook with. But then again, here's the food industry selling us processed rancid oils.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So, so the idea is to get a nice balance of, okay, I've got some protein, I've got a starch, I've got some vegetables, and I've got some fats. And that's a great makeup of a meal. And, again, for me and for my clients, I like to say, hey, the goal is that you have a meal that nourishes you for 4 to 6 hours. Yeah. If I'm hungry an hour or even 2 hours after that meal, I'm like, okay, what was missing? What was my protein? What was my starch? What was my green? What was my fat? And then I can sometimes determine, oh gosh, I didn't have any protein, or, oh, I had too much of this or that, or not enough.
I want to tell a little story from my own experience about this just yesterday and today. Okay, so I'm going to pull my covers here. I've been snacking a lot lately. And last night I made a really wonderful dinner for me and a friend, and it was grilled halibut and some quinoa, and half the plate was salad. And we ate dinner, and then this morning we had some like muesli with berries and seeds and nuts and yogurt for breakfast. So this was what I've eaten these past couple of days. After breakfast, I was so hungry and I was in such a bad mood. And I was thinking I was thinking about the snacking behavior that I've been getting into. And I just stopped to pause, and I thought, I'm under eating. And what's missing in my plate? Fats. I wasn't eating enough fat. And fat, ladies, is the food of the brain. fat is the food of the endocrine system. So, if we're not getting enough fats, we're going to be moody and we're going to be weepy and, all of that. So I had to go back and have a whole other meal of hard-boiled eggs with some olives and some, actually a pork liver pate, which I love, that I got at the farmer's market. And, I had to really literally fatten up my food. I had to have a whole other meal after breakfast this morning because it was so unsatisfying. And, now I feel fine. And I
Good.
know I'm on a steady burn for the next couple of hours, and, I'll eat lunch in an hour or so and I'll be fine. So yeah, so it's a really, this might create a little bit of cognitive dissonance for you who are watching and listening to this. Like, you might think the idea of under eating is like, wait a minute, how could I possibly be under eating? I weigh so much, or I have so much extra weight. But you might be undernourishing yourself. And the task here is to actually eat a meal, and eat as much as until your satiety cues get activated, until your belly says, okay, good, I'm good to go, right?
Absolutely. And, that also has, just like we were talking about when I was talking about eating in the car, it has that idea of, eating with more mindfulness so we can start to feel those. And, if there's a lot of inflammation in the body and excess weight, it is a lot harder and like physiologically to actually hear any satiation cues, where sometimes you eat a meal and you just still feel hungry because your brain is not getting the message that your stomach is full. And so, that's also where I want to almost like unveil, like, for people, when people overeat, is physiologically your body just can't hear those. So
That's
that
called
is a
leptin.
way.
That's leptin resistance.
That's leptin resistance.
Yeah.
So, if there's a lot of shame around, weight gain and overeating, I feel like, let's put the shame over here, because guess what? You can't always feel that feeling. And, but, this is where knowledge is power. But like, if I can go and sit down and have a meal that's truly nourishing over time, and you start filling your body up with a lot of those phytonutrients from all those vegetables and the healthy fats, over time, especially with the fats, the cells start to change.
Yeah.
The cells start to transform. The cell membrane starting to be made of this really healthy fat. And that's where a lot of the communication happens. So that's where our hormones, which leptin is a hormone, are able to really penetrate the cell, and the cell can hear the message, and the cell can take action, and all of, and our cells start communicating
Right.
better. And
What
that's
I call it is your brain and your stomach go to marital counseling. They weren't talking to
yeah.
each other.
And you start to hear the message. And so,
Let's go back to the idea of mindful eating here, because just what we were talking about earlier, that in terms of self-nourishment, what we eat, of course, is absolutely critical. But then there's also how we are eating. So, what you were saying, Mary Sheila, about if you're eating while driving. Now, something that I read from an Ayurveda point of view is that if you're eating while driving, it increases your vata. It's going to bring you up into this airy, speedy, higher frequency place versus bringing you down into a more grounded place. So there's a couple of things also that I want to say about meals as well. May I say those things? In addition to this, what Mary Sheila is pointing out about, like, here's your protein, here's your starchy veg, here's your greens, and here's your fats. Something that I really like to do is look at my plate and just notice the colors on the plate, and just see, like, how visually appealing is this. There's a saying in Japanese that one eats first with the eyes. So, what's going to make your plate beautiful? It's going to be a variety of colors. And for me, if I make a meal that doesn't have a lot of color variety, like, let's say there's some green missing or there's some red missing, I might actually put the food on a green plate, or put the food on a red plate, so that my eyes can say, okay, yes, now it feels complete. So that's something that I really pay attention to. The other thing is to pay attention to textures. So what kind of textures are in your meal? Do you have something creamy, something chewy, something crunchy, something, then we have the flavors, sweet, salty, bitter, and so on. So having a variety of colors and textures and flavors on your plate helps to reduce what in the chef world, in the culinary world, is called palate fatigue. Palate fatigue. So like if you're eating like all salty, your palate after a while just gets overwhelmed. If you're eating everything's all cooked and mushy, your palate is just going to get overwhelmed. If you're eating everything that's just brown. So having some kind of diversity on your plate to avoid palate fatigue, to keep your palate engaged in your food. The other two that I like, and you touched on this a little bit, is something raw with every meal. Neither Mary Sheila nor I are raw foods advocates, but having something that's not cooked. So it could even be like chopped scallions or chopped fresh herbs or grated carrot, or like now during tomato season, I'm just chopping up tomatoes and like a little bit of olive oil and salt. So something raw, and then something fermented. So a little bit of sauerkraut or some fermented vegetables, or maybe you're eating Indian food and you have a little bit of raita with yogurt or what have you. So that will all of those things together. And I know this is a lot, but after a while, it will become, with practice, it becomes intuitive. It becomes a second nature. You will start to embody these things. So there's some other things that I wanted to add in terms of thinking about your food on your plate, your meal.
Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. All of those things. And because you really want it to be a sensual experience and you want to engage all your senses. And that's also using spices. And, Marcella and I both have we met at a college where we both taught. And one of the terms with what you just talked about is booster foods, So the booster foods are adding spices or adding the kraut or seeds or things that are they're small amounts, but they add big flavor and then they boost the nutritional profile. So
Right.
They just make it a more pleasant experience, but it's so good for the digestive tract because the more we have those variety of flavors, like every flavor, like you mentioned, the 6 flavors actually has an action in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And bitter helps us break down fats better and gets all our juices going, and salty helps to liquefy things. And so each flavor has an action, and how important that is to make sure that all those actions are happening in our digestive tract so we can get as much out of that food. As much, we want the flavor and we want to have a good experience, but we want to absorb as much as we can.
Yes. So, yeah, like Indian food, like a lot of the ethnic foods really get this. So for example, let's say we have like a chicken tandoori and we have like a cooked chicken. And I want to give some examples of meals, like we might have a cooked chicken tandoori with a basmati rice pilaf. And then we have like pickled lime that goes with the meal. We have a little raita, a little condiment. In Japanese food, there's a condiment called gomashio that I know you're familiar with. Goma is sesame and shio is salt. So sesame salt that's toasted and ground together that can just go on the food as well. And the sesame seeds boost the sesame seeds are boosting the flavor. Or you can add dried seaweed and you have a seaweed gomashio. Things like that. Like a lot of the ethnic traditions really have it dialed in, is my experience in terms of, food. Or even I'm Sicilian background, and when I was growing up, we had our meals, but then we would have the salad afterward as like the palate cleanser, kind of the intestinal broom, etc. The piece about mindful eating is really important, how we eat. So eat in one place, sit at a table. Now for me, as a single woman, I like to sit on my couch and my meals tend to be one bowl and I sit on my couch. It's just for me much more comfortable than sitting at a table. So, but sit still. And when you eat, just eat. And then we were talking about satiety. There's the Japanese have a saying, hara hachibu, which means 8 parts out of 10 full. So the practice of eating and just eating in one place without your phone, without your bills, without the news in the background getting you all upset, When you just simply eat, and when the food you're eating is nutritionally dense and appropriate for you and good for you, you will begin to heal, just as Mary Sheila was saying, that body, the brain belly connection. Your brain and your stomach will be able to listen to each other a little bit better. It takes about 20 minutes for the brain to fully get, okay, enough. So mindful eating, eating in one place, is one way that you can begin to rebuild your ability to tune in to your body having enough food and to be able to avoid overeating. Yeah. Is there anything else that I'm missing about mindful eating here? I mean, I know
No,
there's a lot we could say.
totally. I mean, I love what you said too about how you like to sit in the couch,
I
on
love
the
to sit on my
couch.
couch.
Well, and one of the things that is good about that is if you're not sitting at a table, you have one hand that's holding your bowl or your plate and the other hand that's holding your fork. And as long as you don't have your TV on or something, it's a lot less distracting.
That's right.
Sometimes if you have it on the table, so if you're somebody that maybe really struggles with that, even sitting outside can sometimes add another layer of mindfulness because you have the oxygen. And one of the things that I think is really important when it comes to mindful eating is to, before you take your first bite, is to really engage your senses and take a few deep breaths and also summon up gratitude for what you have. And that's another way of saying grace. And that is so helpful to get the body into the parasympathetic rest and digest mode. And a lot of times, when you start a new habit, you might forget and you're like, oh man, I started again and I forgot to do that. There's no reason why in that moment you can't put your fork down, look at your plate, and practice that. Because again, the more you start to practice those habits, the more they become embedded. So even if you forget 5 minutes into the meal, or even at the end of your meal, do it then. Your body will start to get into that habit and remembering. And even then it's going to help you with digestion. And then once you're in that habit and you're even doing it, you can do it in the middle of the meal. And that's when you can say, let me just check in with my hunger. Like, how hungry am I now? And that, again, we're being mindful while we're eating.
Yeah. And something else, another tip, a mindful eating tip that really helps that is put your utensil down
between bites. Yes.
And chew. Like I notice I can get into this thing where I have a mouthful of food and I have my fork right here with another mouthful ready to go. Like, yeah. And that, yeah. And when I really tune into that, my body's a little bit like,
yeah,
just put it down,
yeah,
and chew the food.
And I have one more thing that has really helped me, because I know so many of us have this whole thing where we have to eat everything on our plate, and it goes way back to, I'm one of 7. We all have our stories. Right. And what I really have said to myself is, when I am able to tune in with that fullness, is, Mary Sheila, you do not have to eat everything on your plate. You are the queen of this house. You can eat the rest of it later if you want to eat it. And if you don't want to waste it, you can just throw it in the fridge. You do not have to eat everything on this plate right now. And
that is so important.
Yeah, it's been a game changer for me, because I was, and I still am sometimes, if I'm not as mindful, part of the, clean your plate club. But you don't have to be, but you can change that. Like, I can change that dynamic of, oh, I came from a huge family. I had to eat fast to get seconds, or whatever the story is, right? I have that story too, but I can change my story, because I'm in my castle. I'm not a kid in my parents' house anymore. I'm the boss.
Yes, let's change the story. That's wonderful. And of course, changing the story is so much of what we do in the Women, Food, and Forgiveness Academy. We're not only changing our nutritional story, we're changing our emotional story, our spiritual story, our metabolic story. Yeah, changing the story. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any final words, Mary Sheila?
Yeah, I just the reminder of meals versus snacks, and just making sure you're feeling nourished. And this is also not to say don't ever snack, because that whole idea that we gave. Sometimes you might put a meal on a small plate, and you just, even on that small plate, you want to say, what's my protein, starch, green, like, how am I balanced in this meal? And that there's an idea too of just, how am I going to eat something like that for breakfast? But just being open to creating balance on your plate to bring that into your body.
I love it. I love it. Beautiful. Yeah, I want to end with gratitude. Um, when we practice gratitude, we are reminded that our food is a miracle. Our bodies are a miracle. And I also just want to express gratitude to you, Mary Sheila. Thank you so much for all your wisdom. I told you she's a girl genius. All right, we will be doing more. We will be having more conversations like this. Stay tuned. And yeah, why don't you go ahead and start practicing putting your meals together and let us know how it goes. All right, lots of love and bye for now.